Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll let folks get settled in and we will be starting momentarily. All right, hello and welcome to our Helping Men Recover Working Effectively with Men with our presenter, Dan Griffin. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Great Lakes ATTC and SAMHSA. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are funded by SAMHSA under the following cooperative agreements. The views expressed in this webinar are the views of the speaker and do not reflect the official position of DHHS or SAMHSA. The ATTC network uses affirming language to promote the promises of recovery by advancing evidence-based and culturally informed practices. We do have a few housekeeping items for you. If you are having any technical issues, please individually message me, Alyssa Qualla, or Jen Winslow in the chat section, and we would be happy to assist you. If you have any questions for the speaker, please put the questions in the Q&A section of your toolbar. If captions or live transcript would be helpful, please locate that option to enable on your Zoom toolbar. You will be directed to a short survey at the end of today's presentation. It should only take 2 to 3 minutes to fill out, and we would greatly appreciate that. Certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all who attended today's session in full. This can take up to 2 weeks. If you'd like to stay connected with the Great Lakes ATTC, follow us on Facebook, check out our LinkedIn, our YouTube channel, and our podcast channel. I'm super honored and excited to have our presenter, Dan Griffin, with us today. Dan Griffin is an internationally recognized author, thought leader, and expert on men's relationships and masculinity. Dan has dedicated his life and work exploring and redefining what it means to be a man in the 21st century. He is committed to helping men be better men by understanding the impact of the man rules on their lives. Dan also helps men find the success in their personal lives they are striving for in their professional ones. Dan Griffin's book and curricula are all focused on helping men and dads live their best lives. Dan served as a senior fellow at the Meadows, world-renowned experts treating addictive disorders and trauma from 2015 to 2017. Dan earned a master's degree in sociology from the University of Kansas. For his graduate work, Dan completed the first qualitative study centered on the social construction of masculinity in the culture of Alcoholics Anonymous. Dan is in long-term recovery and lives with his family in Los Angeles. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining this conversation. It is a 2-hour presentation. There will be no breaks. Hopefully it will go by pretty quickly. There's a lot to cover, and there will be opportunities for people to respond, and our friends Jen and Alyssa will be watching the chat to share with me at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started right now. All right. So again, thanks everybody for being here. The title is Helping Men Recover, Working with Men More Effectively. If you're familiar with my work, you know that one of the curricula that I have co-authored is called Helping Men Recover. So it's a shameless plug as well. So there's various quotes, I guess you could say, that kind of drive my business and the work that I do. But over the years, it's really become clear that, if we open men's hearts and we heal their pain, that we can truly change the world. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we'll get into some of that in the conversation today. So thank you again to Great Lakes. Thank you to Jean and to all the staff. But thank you to all of you for showing up. And I encourage you to, keep an open mind. Some of the things that I say could be provocative. I like to say that my intention is to be provocative, but never offensive. So if that occurs for anybody, please reach out to me afterwards and give me the opportunity to clean that up or work that through with you, because I don't ever want anybody leaving here feeling as though they or somebody or some issue they care about has been disparaged or disrespected. All right, so this is a trauma-informed training. I've been doing trauma-informed care a long time. I kind of fell into it through some grace, and I'm so grateful for it. But I'm going to invite all of you just to join me in just a really quick breathing exercise. And wherever you are, wherever you're seated, I encourage you to just relax your body, relax your head, relax your arms, relax your legs, just relax and take a deep breath in through your nose and let it out through your mouth. And take a deep breath in through your nose and let it out through your mouth. And take a deep breath in through your nose, hold it, and let it out through your mouth. Take a deep breath in through your nose, hold it, and let it out with a sigh. And last one, take a deep breath in through your nose, hold it, and let it out with as loud of a sigh as you can. Now, you may be sitting there thinking like, oh, that's kind of goofy, or it feels uncomfortable, a little embarrassing, whatever. But it's also very, very intentional to kind of engage the parasympathetic nervous system, but the nervous system in general, the body, the brain, the mind, spirit connection, breathing, just the simple act of breathing, just doing something like I just did, which took about 15 seconds, 20 seconds. Doing that before every group, before meeting with every client, doing it before every staff meeting, doing something that sends a message not only to your brain, but to the collective conscience of whoever you're with, that says, we're going to get centered, we're going to get grounded, and we're going to come to like this moment. That's a big piece. I'll show you this again, but if you're interested in signing up for my newsletter and kind of following what I do, this is one of the ways that you can do that, is just this QR code. So everything I do comes out of this paradigm called values-based services. Okay, and so it's a 6-prong thing. When I learned it, it looked a little bit different, so I've enhanced it, I believe. I've certainly created my version of it. So it's got 6. It used to have 5, and some of the language is a little bit different. But the key is that when you look at your services that you're providing individuals, you're thinking about these 6 areas: gender responsive, trauma informed, cultural humility, recovery oriented, spiritual enrichment, and family centric. And then you're looking at them from a systemic perspective, right? So what that means is you're looking in the area of program, services, client, staff, organization. So like when we go into a program that hires us to do an extensive assessment or consultation with them, we start with an assessment, and then we end up with a 30-40 page report, but all kind of evaluating how a program's doing in these 6 areas, and then within these 5 domains of each area. What we'll be talking about primarily today will be gender responsive, trauma informed, and even some cultural humility. And you'll notice that I talk about cultural humility, not cultural competence. There's cultural responsivity. There's different kind of language, but for me, the cultural humility component, it just really reinforces the fact that, especially those of us from dominant groups, our job is not to become competent in somebody else's culture. It's to have the humility to hear them, to witness their experiences, and to support them in their own journey of identity. Men's integrated treatment is something that we created. Stephanie Covington, if you're familiar with her work, she's really kind of been a major trailblazer when it came to women's work, and she and I and Rick Dower, who is in Minnesota, we collaborated on helping men recover. But she created women's integrated treatment, and so we then also created this concept of men's integrated treatment, and I've continued to tailor it and enhance it. And so really what it's looking at is looking at male psychological development. And we'll talk a lot more about that, but really understanding that the gender conditioning of males and male identified individuals is significant, and it starts very, very early in our lives. But then you combine that with thinking about mental health, addiction, trauma, and I would even throw in shame as well as a component of that. And so what we talk about is being gender responsive, not gender specific. Gender specific is great, right? But it's a limited approach to gender focused treatment. The quick way to understand this is to simply say that gender specific is about the services, while gender responsive is about the system. And so when you're focused on the system, it's not like just, hey, we have a men's group and we have, a book about men in recovery or something to that effect. You're also saying, hey, we've trained the staff on how they interact with men. We've trained them how to respond to men from a perspective of male psychological development. We've looked at how we've designed our program, and we've looked at what's on the walls, and we've looked at kind of our own biases against men, or how we interact with men. And there's a systemic kind of view toward how we do that. I fundamentally believe men are not the problem. How men have been raised is the problem. And of course, we'll spend a lot of time talking about that. So men's integrated treatment, what exactly is it? So I just, right off the bat, okay, I've been doing this a long time. I know some of you on this call or this webinar, have been doing it longer than I have, but I'm almost 30 years in the field, so I've earned some right to say I've been doing this a long time. And I just am absolutely convinced that this is one of the most critical aspects of effective service delivery, and that's our own self-awareness and personal work. And every therapist should have a therapist kind of philosophy, right? But it's really also that idea of you cannot take somebody where you haven't been, and you cannot transmit something you do not have. So it's really kind of thinking like from this perspective of like working with men, right? So like if any of you on here have done trainings with me, and especially if you did a helping men recover training, then at one point you had to write a letter to your father. Well, the father is a huge relationship for so many of us, and it defines and influences how we think about men and how we interact with men and all of that, right? So that's a part of the work that, when we work with individuals about how to work more effectively with men, we always are coming back to this: facilitator self-awareness and personal work. Then what we also talk about for men's integrated treatment is that trauma is a gendered experience, right? So very often, even some of the top trauma experts, I say this respectfully, but I also say it from an informed perspective because I've worked with them and I've studied a lot of them, but a lot of them present trauma as though it's gender neutral. And the truth is, it's never gender neutral as far as I'm concerned. And that's because there are a lot of layers to trauma, to the trauma framework, to how we understand trauma, how trauma came about in our field, the different ways that we have viewed it. And then just because trauma is so connected to abuse and violence, well, you can't talk about abuse and violence in a non-gendered way as well. And so when we begin to think of trauma as a gendered experience, what does that mean? And so then it's really like, what does it mean for a man or a boy to have trauma, to acknowledge that they have trauma, to work through the trauma and all of those aspects, right? The traditional treatment was not created with men's unique issues and needs in mind. So what we hear a lot still, which is kind of surprising to me, but whatever. When I first started doing this work and I was like, hey, I want to do something for men because I saw all this stuff being done for women, right? Helping women recover, a woman's way through the 12 steps. And then I was at Hazelden's 50th anniversary, and there's this woman, Judith Jordan, and she was talking, and she was very, very well known for the work she was doing for women. And I was like, I want to do something for men. And a common response that I would get was, well, but everything's already for men. Fair enough. That's true. It was run by men and it was technically for men. But, and this is the critical, very critical part of that, it was not created with men's unique issues and needs in mind. It was never gender responsive. And so that is the shift, right? So therefore, both men and women have not been trained to work most effectively with men. And I do these trainings, I do webinars, whatever, all the stuff that I do. And I usually will ask people, how many of you in your school, in your training, got like detailed, focused guidance on how to work most effectively with men and male identified individuals? And not many people raise their hands. And so one of the things I like to say with my company is that we teach what you should have learned in school. Because where I'm at now at 51, I'm probably closer to the end of my career than certainly the beginning of it. I'm thinking like, how are we going to get to the point where this is taught, where this is regularly taught in schools and programs? So when people come out and I'm doing a talk or somebody else is doing a talk, it's review instead of how it is now for a lot of people, which is it's new. It's new information for how you can not only effectively reach men, but really feel good about the work you do with men. And don't get me wrong, I know a lot of you on this webinar, this may be review for you to a degree in the sense that you're really good therapists and you've figured out a lot of this stuff and you have been doing it and you have been really kind of evolving in how you work with men because you paid attention in how they've responded. But to think of us having a really kind of institutional knowledge and approach to this, we are very far from that. So always say that we do not know who a man should be. Our only job is to help facilitate that self-discovery. And what that means is that like, if you're going to do men's integrated treatment, if you're really going to be gender responsive, then a common conversation that you want to have with these men is, what kind of man do you want to be? Like, you really get them to think about what kind of man they want to be, and then move constantly into that question and support them in that. But it's not ours to decide what that looks like. We can offer examples, we can offer options, but more than anything, it's a very personal and kind of unique journey that we get to support those men doing. And so where we have to be careful, in my experience, is our own implicit bias about men. Oh, but men should be this. Oh, but if you're going to be a good man is this and this and this. Or a real man is this, this, and this. Or the man that I want, And so we have to watch how we may project that onto the men with whom we're working, and unintentionally, most of the time, kind of put certain values or expectations on them. Confrontation as a primary mechanism for treating men is not effective, yet that philosophy remains in the field. It is surprising to me how much that still can come up. It's not that it's like although there are still some programs, I've just heard of a couple recently, and I'm sure there's many more out there that believe like the goal of a therapist is to break a man down. You got to break that ego down. You got to get rid of his arrogance, his cockiness, his entitlement, all of that. And in some truth, I mean, like that that's real. Like there is a need to help a man really take a look at those things, and it may take some really challenging confrontation to get through that. So confrontation as a tool is great, right? Especially when it's like carefrontation is what some people call it, carefrontation instead of confrontation. But that is as a tool. If it's your primary mechanism, there's absolutely no research that supports or shows the efficacy of that approach. And I'm happy to say that, from when I first started talking about this stuff, I think it has been changing considerably. And I think one of the catalysts for that change, quite frankly, has been the broad acceptance of motivational interviewing as a tool as well. The goal is to create a healthy relationship to power and control. So often you hear people kind of implying that power and control, there's something wrong with them, or men, just abuse power and control, or, all kinds of different comments around this reality. But the truth is, every human being has a relationship to power and control. And part of male conditioning tends to be an unhealthy relationship to power and control. And so, how do we kind of really focus on that and unpack that for the men and help them kind of move into, well, what does healthy power look like? What does healthy control look like? And what are all the ways in which I'm not doing that? And what are some of the ways in which I do that? But really looking at that is a key component. For us, for those of us who work with men, I think two kind of key aspects would be compassion and non-judgment. And what that means is, like sometimes we have to dig deep for compassion for some of these men that we work with. I mean, if you work in the jails and the prisons, or you work in like IPV programs, or any, for some of them are still called domestic violence programs or something like that, you hear some really horrible things that men have done. And you even may see some horrible behavior, and they may even abreact in a client session, and they may even put some of that on you. So how do we hold compassion for these men? And it's really, really important to understand compassion. For whatever reason, people seem to think this. If a man comes to me who has done a lot of harm in his relationships, right? So he causes harm chronically in his relationships, and in his relationships to women, let's say. So he's just been very acted out many times, and caused harm, been violent, and abusive. So he comes to me and I'm talking to him. What compassion looks like is an attempt to understand the wounds that he's acting out of and to help heal those wounds so that the behavior can stop, while at the same time being very, very clear that all of that behavior is completely unacceptable. That can be a part of compassion too, that people, I think, sometimes don't understand. And then the non-judgment is just the idea, again, of like suspending judgment of where I think a man is, where I think he's supposed to be, where he's been, what he's done, and moving into that, what's called that unconditional positive regard, right? We're going to talk about the man roles in a second, but always look for ways to reframe a man's behavior through the context of the man rules and safety. And I'll talk more about that and you'll have a better understanding of exactly what that means. But again, it goes back to what I just said. Men are not the problem. How men have been raised is the problem, right? So that man's behavior is less of an issue than how he is following some script for masculinity that he's not even aware of, that's causing him so much problems and potentially causing problems to others. Then when you begin to be trauma informed about it and you really think from a perspective of safety, what does that mean? Sexuality is essential subject matter for men's treatment, period. No man should leave treatment without having some conversation around sex and sexuality. I would say probably there are very few relapses that men and male identified individuals have that are not connected to sex and sexuality in some way. Very, very few. So, and because it's so deeply connected to men's conditioning, to male conditioning, our gender conditioning, it just is all the more important to have, even if you only have them for a short time, to have some sort of conversation that helps them explore this. Men will hide fear, discomfort, and confusion behind bravado and humor. So then there's like some key fidelity elements that I've discovered over the years, that I just, they're a part of everything I do and the work that I do with men. One of them may surprise you, may not surprise you, but it's small groups. And what that means is it doesn't mean that your groups have to be small, but it means that if you really want to change the dynamics and change engagement and participation of men in your programs, let's say you've got a 12-person group, right? You're meeting with 12 men and you've got this group and you're trying to run group and you're asking them questions. The more breakout groups into groups of 3 that you build into your group time, it will change your groups. If you feel like you are struggling to get them to open up, if you feel like there's only 1 or 2 guys that are talking and then the rest are just kind of not really participating, start using small groups and watch that whole dynamic change. And it not only changes with them in the small groups, it ultimately affects the whole dynamic of the group as a whole. So 3 is the magic number. The expectations must be very clear. When you break them out, you can visit each group to just kind of check in on them without, eavesdropping, and allow the small groups to exceed time limits. Like, for instance, in all the curricula that I've written, we're very structured and we offer breakout times, but we also say to facilitators in the trainings that we do, we say, hey, if they're really into it, that's why we're here, is to get them to open up. So, just because it says 20 minutes in the facilitator guide doesn't mean you don't let it go over. And then if the men are struggling, which can happen, then just manipulate the composition of the small groups. But I can't say enough about small groups. And I give total credit to Rick Dower for bringing that element to us. Interactive lectures, maybe you're talking about tough topics like sex and sexuality, violence and abuse, or this or that. You can talk at guys. It doesn't work, but you can do it. And you can just kind of, do your little monologues and all that stuff. And we say our stuff. But the truth is, the more we engage the men in the process, the more involved they are. And what an interactive lecture is when you use kind of a Socratic sort of process for the men, where they have the opportunity to teach the material themselves. We're going to do an example of that coming up shortly, when we do the man rules exercise. That's an interactive lecture because I do a very brief overview of what the man rules are, and then I ask the participants to name the man rules, right? That's an interactive lecture. In Helping Men Recover, when we talk about violence and abuse, I mean, I think we found one of the more effective ways to get men to open up and really talk about their experiences with violence and abuse in a pretty beautiful way. And most of it is because we're not talking at them, we're asking them to really kind of lead the conversation. It's the interactive lectures are like one of the most difficult skills. You got to be prepared for anything and everything to come up, and so you have to navigate some of that. Allow the experience to be organic. Know that there will be huge disparities from one group to the next. You can have one group that's like so engaged, one person opens up, and then it just kind of changes everything. And then others, it's a little bit more challenging, but that's kind of group work, period. The men are not contributing. There's a good reason. Usually, it's about safety. And then just trust the process. And you can always add a little something yourself just to kind of help guide the process. Another key fidelity element is a constant reference to the man rules dichotomy. So what is the man rules dichotomy? It's one of the coolest things that I found. I mean, and it came out of my research, so I guess I'm a little biased, but I think this is incredible, right? So you have the man rules, which we're going to talk about even more in a moment, but you have these man rules. Don't cry, don't ask for help, don't show emotion, don't be vulnerable, be a sexual superman, don't show weakness. Like these are some of the key directions in the script of masculinity. They're the rules, right? Why do I call them the rules? Because one, it's what we're supposed to do, and if we don't do them, we tend to have some kind of emotional experience about it. Like there's a lot of young guys, and some people even on this presentation might be like, but Dan, that's not me. And what I would say is that may not be you, but if I were in a group with you and your peers and I asked you, what are the man rules? Those are the answers you would give me. And what's powerful about that is then that means that's inside of you and inside of your awareness. And what we're often doing is we're saying, I'm not that, I'm not that, oh, I'm this, but at the same time, what I've also found is a lot of guys who say, oh, those don't apply to me, that's not who I am. What they're really saying is, that's not who I want to be. But when they find themselves really stressed or feeling unsafe, or when they find themselves, in different situations, they are surprised at how much these man rules come out as part of their experience. So you have the man rules, that's one part. Then you have what we ask men, male identified individuals, to do in therapy and recovery. And if you look at these two lists, they are directly opposite of one another. And that to me is what's so powerful, this dichotomy, because the man rules are what we know, what we resist, but it's part of the conditioning. And it's not part of the conditioning kind of like, oh, hey, here's these rules. It's before the majority of us could think, we were already following these man rules. We were already being told to follow these man rules. We were already being told about what to, how to act. 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. Go to a kindergarten, you can see it. And then, watch those kids, as I have done with my daughter. I'm very aware of this stuff and I'm very interested in it. So I watched my daughter in kindergarten. I watched my daughter and her friends in first grade, second grade. I watched the boys. I watched the boys go from being really emotional and connected and vulnerable to, by fourth or fifth grade, showing a certain difference. And yet those kids will probably say the man rules don't apply to them, right? So what's the point? The point is that the man rules ultimately are about safety. right? The man rules are ultimately about safety. It's how we find some degree of emotional or psychological safety, whether we want to or not. On a daily basis, I go to these man rules when I don't want to. I could give you examples from just yesterday, for God's sake, of being like, oh, yeah, no, that is not how I wanted to show up, right? And it was connected though to some degree of emotional safety. But it becomes a knee-jerk reaction, almost like a trauma response, because it's so fight or flight in many ways that we're not even thinking about it. And then we're like, oh my God, did I act that way? Women have it too. And there's the woman rules, and that's a whole nother deal. Um, but what's powerful about this dichotomy, and why I believe it's really important to reference this dichotomy, to teach the men about this dichotomy and reference this dichotomy, is the fact that because they're opposite, if the man rules are about safety, then all that's in this therapy and recovery is unsafe. And so when we put them in a clinical environment, when we put them in a therapeutic group, when we're putting them in treatment, we are putting them in an unsafe situation, and we are asking them to step out of their safety, but we often don't recognize it. And we often don't appreciate what we're asking them to do. And we often don't see then when they go back to the man rules in the community, on the unit, in their interactions with peers, we don't see that that's just them attempting to find some degree of safety. And instead, we try to shut it down, or we look at the external behavior, but we're not looking at it, as you may remember from a previous slide, we're not looking at it through the lens of the man rules and safety. And that's, for me, why this dichotomy is so powerful. And it permeates a man's recovery experience long after he is done with you. Another fidelity element, again, like I said, is allowing the men to talk, creating a space where the men can talk and giving them, because, what we know from research now, but what we know, I think, just as human beings, is that we do all want to connect. Everybody wants to connect. And these men have a lot that they've been carrying around because the man rules tell them they can't talk about any of this stuff. Now they're in an environment that tells them they can talk about it. And so we just really try to give them the space to talk about it, to find common ground, rather than individually kind of singling out somebody, showing that group experience. How many of us have ever had that fear? Dan just shared something really powerful. How many of you can identify with what Dan is talking about? And you get that, you help to attack the shame and the vulnerability hangover that a lot of the men experience when they do take those risks. And so these are all part of the strategies that we can use. Non-shaming and non-confrontational behavior. Look, a lot of the times we're working with men, they do something, it triggers us, and then we go to power and control, whether we like it or not, and then we want to shut it down. And we have different approaches to how we work with men based on our experiences with men. And it goes to that very first slide. And if we haven't looked at that stuff, then we're going to just go to what we know, right? We go to what we know. And my kind of encouragement is, of course, we have to pay attention to that. But if in the back of my mind constantly is this question, how does that fit with the man you want to be? That's it. That's it. Dan, it looks like you're having some difficulty. I saw what just happened with you and Chris. How does that interaction fit with the man you want to be? Dan, I heard what you're saying about your partner, and how you're treating them. It sounds like there's other stuff going on. How does that fit with the man you want to be, though? How does that fit with the partner that you want to be? There's no shaming, there's really no confrontation, and it's just a question back to them. Continuous assessment, especially when it comes to abuse and trauma. Very few men will acknowledge physical or sexual abuse during an initial interview, and avoid closed-ended questions. Always avoid closed-ended questions. That's one of the big lessons of motivational interviewing. And then reassess for abuse trauma histories after a man has been in programming for multiple sessions and has demonstrated that he feels a level of safety. As you know, I mean, look, there are different approaches that we can take to men's trauma, right? We can do the opening assessment, we can talk to the man, we can have the open-ended questions, he can respond basically saying he has no history of trauma, and we can be like, oh, thank God, and then move forward. Or we can have this kind of constant question and curiosity that says, okay, let's talk to him now, understanding that he only feels so safe and probably capable of sharing so much. And let's make sure that there's constant assessment so that we constantly create a space for him to be able to share the pain that he's carrying. I talked about this previously regarding compassion, but like we encourage programs, quite frankly, to put this up, this statement, to put this statement up wherever your clients are, in like the group room or in your individual therapist rooms or wherever, multiple places, however you want to do it. But whatever happened to you as a child was not your fault. Whatever you do as an adult, you are 100% responsible for. And sometimes we also even have a third. If you are engaged in any harmful or abusive behavior, you are responsible and it must stop now. Right? So it's like the both and. Whatever happened to you as a child was not your fault. That's absolutely true. What you do now, you are 100% responsible for. Frankly, it's not that I don't care what happened to you as a child, but it will never, ever be a reason or an excuse for how you are behaving towards somebody or treating somebody now. All right, so overview of the core concepts. If some of you are familiar with my work or my talks, I mean, everything I do kind of comes back to this idea of the water, and it has two fish in the bottom of the ocean. Another fish swims up and looks at him and says, hey guys, how's the water? And then swims off, and the two fish look at each other and they say, what the hell is water? Right? Like, that's us. We are in the water, and gender conditioning is a very, very deep part of the water. There are other aspects of the water, but the water is reality. The water is the reality in which we are constantly swimming and so often unaware. And it's all these different elements that make up the water. But gender is a very, very deep part of the water. I mean, all around the world, when you ask a woman, you know, like when she's pregnant, one of the main questions that we ask is, what are you having? A boy or a girl, right? And it's that dichotomy, it's that, I mean, there are countries where the answer to that question determines whether or not the baby is born, whether the baby is thrown into a river and drowned, whether the baby grows up to have an education, whether the baby is beaten, whether the baby is sold and put into a child militia, whether, you know, I mean, there's so many aspects of it, but just from the answer of what are you having? But it's not just that. Those are the more extreme examples. But then there's just all of the gender conditioning that happens, all of the narratives that we create about our children, about these beings that are growing inside the womb, and who they're going to be, what they're going to be, how we're going to treat them, and we don't even mean to treat them. All of that is the water. All of that, it's the implicit bias, it's the gender conditioning, it's the messages that we take in constantly kind of take in, that we don't even realize we're taking in. It's what enables my daughter, when she was 2 years old, two, maybe three, when we were at daycare in Minnesota, because I used to live there, and this gentleman, this Native American man, he walked in, he was like 6'3", 6'4", long, long, long black hair, right? And she looked up at him and she said, "That is a very tall woman." And that's because the script, the messages that she had was that long hair was only for women. That was it. Her mom and I hadn't told her that. That's just one kind of banal sort of message or example, but it runs very, very deep. It runs deep inside the messages about connection and relationship and emotional expression. All of that is the water, right? And today in our society, there is a lot of confusion. This is triple wingding font in Microsoft Word. Some of you probably use it for your case notes, but this is the word confusion, because that's what's happening right now in our society. There's a massive disruption that's happening in gender and gender identity. There are, according to the last time I looked on a website, and I'm trying to remember where I found it, but there are 107 different gender identities. 107. I was reading through them and I was like, I don't even understand some of these myself. And it is because the younger generations are really trying to find freedom from gender oppression. Freedom, from that big speech that America Ferrera made in Barbie, right? That's what we're trying to find the freedom from. And Ken could have made a similar speech if it had been written a little bit differently, right? And those are what the gender identities are kind of really trying to shift. But as a result, it's creating this confusion for the younger generations, but even for the older generations, even myself. Like when I got into recovery and I was getting all these messages about being a sensitive guy and doing this, and then I would go out and I would be sensitive and vulnerable with women because I thought that's what they wanted. And yet they didn't seem to be able to not only appreciate it but respect it. And I hear that over and over and over, quite frankly, from men. And part of it is because women have internalized the man rules as much as men have. And women don't even realize they're doing it a lot of the times, but they reject men who are more vulnerable or are acting a certain way, or they reject because they don't know how to process it or handle it. And that happens. And men do it too, and men do it with each other. But the reality is, within men in particular, within men is this deep confusion about who am I supposed to be? Who am I supposed to be? What kind of man am I supposed to be? What kind of man do I get to be? What kind of man is acceptable? Where am I going to get laughed at? When am I going to be accepted? When am I going to be, told I'm a real man? That, I believe, is a core conversation we can be having with our clients, with our male clients. If we are not talking to them about what kind of man they want to be, what kind of man they feel pressure to be, what kind of man they've been, all of that, that's critically related to recovery. That's critically related to mental health. That's critically related to any kind of healing work that we do, because it's so core to who we are. It's so core to identity. So the confusion is a good thing, quite frankly. If we can tap into the confusion, if we can help the man see the confusion, then we can really have an amazing opportunity to give them the space to create the identity that they really want. And so that leads us to like the gender unicorn, right? So some of you may be familiar with the genderbread person, and now there's the gender unicorn. And it's interesting because the genderbread person was done by a cisgender individual who was really trying to be helpful, but as a result, he had a little bit of a blinder on one aspect of this. And so the Trans Student Educational Resources Group came up with the gender unicorn to say it really should look like this. And I didn't know about the gender unicorn. I was doing the genderbread person. And I was very respectfully confronted by a trans individual um, who identified that way when they introduced themselves to me after a talk I gave. And they could have embarrassed me. They could have embarrassed me in the talk, or pointed it out at least in the talk. They came up afterwards. They said, "Hey, are you familiar with this?" I'm like, "No, I'm not." They felt respect. I felt respected. It was a wonderful connection. And I wish there were more of that in this space, because people are so entitled right now around their identity, and people are so reactive, and people are so like, kind of like, so waiting to be offended, so just ready to be offended. And that interaction that I had with this individual, and they had somebody else with them. I mean, it was just so great. Like, they complimented me on, because I did a presentation on gender at the National Drug Court Conference. There was like 1,000 people there. I mean, it was huge. And like, they were very complimentary of how I, a cisgender straight male, kind of did it. And then they gave me some pointers, and I was incredibly receptive, to that. So my point is, yes, this is about working with men more effectively, but in some ways it's working with gender and gender identity more effectively, because you have individuals, maybe they grew up male, maybe now they're not, maybe they're more non-binary, trans, whatever it is, but they all grew up with the script inside of them. All, like, so many trans women, right? Part of their work is having to undo the impact of all the male conditioning that they got that just didn't work or fit for them. But for non-binary individuals, I mean, you're going to have more and more people coming into your programs who don't identify as male or female, and they're in the space of one of the 107 that I mentioned. How are you going to work with them? How are you going to respond? And then if they're male or male identified, then it's kind of like, all right, well, then let's talk about, like, what does that mean to you? What does that look like for you? And, like, if you could envision, like, the best man that you could be, what would that look like? Do some visioning exercises. Those are always, like, really powerful to do. But, like, that's the kind of work, right? Another concept that kind of I use, and have been using quite a bit more, is this idea of the four horsemen. So we're talking about addiction, but you saw in the men's integrated treatment where I talked about male psychological development, addiction, mental health, trauma, and then I said shame should really go there. For me, and this is kind of a side note, I mean, I do a whole nother presentation just on this, but I think it's become really important to me personally to just really reinforce this. The four horsemen are addiction, shame, trauma, and mental health. And what do I mean by that? Well, the four horsemen's a reference, it's a biblical reference, and I'm not, it's not from a religious perspective, it's just a cultural perspective. The four horsemen are fairly well known. But the four horsemen are the riders of the apocalypse, right? They're basically the ones who are announcing the end of the world. And so for me, the end of this world, right, that we're in, because maybe there's something even more amazing if we can heal all of this stuff. But mental health, addiction, trauma, and shame, they all ride together. And we have to stop treating one as though it is more important than the other, or that by solving one, right? Because the new thing in trauma informed care and trauma treatment and all that stuff, which I have a deep, deep respect for, anybody who knows my work knows that's true. But at the same time, the message that healing trauma heals everything else, it's just not correct. Healing trauma is amazing, and it can have an amazing impact, and it can unblock major blocks for people who have been struggling with addiction or long into their recovery. A lot of us, I've got 29 years of sobriety, and I've been watching so many friends in the last 10 years get into trauma therapy. And out here on West Coast in the LA, I mean, it's just like people are talking about it all the time. And now they're just talking about it matter of factly. When I started talking about trauma treatment in Minnesota, and men in AA, I mean, it was like not well received. And so my point is like it's growing. The awareness is growing. The appreciation is growing. But we have to be very careful about these silos that we tend to create and this kind of wanting things to be separate. They really are much more intricately connected than I think sometimes we give credit for. So the man rules, I've already talked about the man rules, but this is an exercise we do with the men, and I encourage you, like, whether you use any of my work, it really doesn't matter. I'm trying to give you tools that you can use to work with men more effectively, no matter what tools you're using. And I will tell you that if you run a group with men and all you simply do is say, hey, today, you know what? I want to just talk to you guys about being a man. And I want to talk to you about the rules we have for being men in this society and all the rules that you follow or don't want to follow, or you don't think you're following, or you're following, or other people are following. All of the stuff that's inside that gender conditioning called the man rules. And then you get a flip chart or board or whatever, and then you just ask them to name the man rules, and you write down everything they say. And you keep writing down everything they say until you have something that looks like this. And then you have a conversation about it. And you say, what's it been like trying to follow these rules? Where have they caused you pain? Where have they worked? Where haven't they worked? How many of you are here after relapsing? And which rules do you think contributed to your relapse? That's a powerful question. That has elicited some really very powerful stuff. These aren't all of the man rules, but I mean, there's a lot of nuances. I do like a 2-hour presentation just on this slide. This slide alone, I do a 2-hour presentation because the don'ts are so powerful, and don't be a girl and don't be gay is still so powerful. And these smaller ones, they're very powerful, but they're not as loud as these other ones. And the don't cry, but men have a much better idea of who they aren't because of the don'ts than who they are. Or you have this sentence around sex: have as much sex as possible whenever possible with as many hot and different chicks as possible, with as little connection as possible, with as big of a dick as possible. That sentence, right? I use the double entendre. That is a sentence for men. That is how men are sentenced to experience sex and intimacy. And the more you kind of grow in your recovery, and the more you kind of begin to really look at that stuff and unpack it, it can be very, very powerful. And yes, I say chicks in that sentence because that's in the language of men. Like, I sponsor a lot of guys in the 12-step programs, and it's like, when they're talking about girls and chicks, I'm like, I'm going to suggest that how you talk about women makes a difference. And so I'm at least going to ask you, when you're talking to me, that you refer to them as women. Will they call themselves girls? That may be. But what's your history and what's your track record with treating women respectfully? So it's that kind of conversation, right? No shaming there, a little bit of confrontation, but more than anything, right? It's kind of helping these men what kind of man do you want to be? What kind of man do you want to be? Do you want to be a guy who goes around calling chicks and girls, or do you want to be somebody who really engenders respect? Oh, you have 3 daughters? And how do you want to talk about women? You're married to a woman? Okay. Well, So do you want to talk about women one way when you're with her and one way when you're not? And you have that conversation. Those are the kinds of conversations that you can have when you begin to talk about the man rules. What are the man rules for sex? What does it mean to, when like, how old were you when you heard don't cry? Who was saying it, And the truth is that when they really kind of get into it, we tend to think of men as being the arbiters of these rules. But I want to assure you, women are vicious with these rules. Again, sometimes with their kids, and they do it with their kids the same reason that some men do it with their kids. They don't want their kids to be beat up. They don't want their kids to be weak. They don't want their kids, I've had so many women who are professionals, right, in a training with me, take me aside and say, Jesus, I thought I was protecting my son. And I said, look, you're in a no-win situation. You don't raise him with the man rules, then he's more vulnerable. You raise him with the man rules, then it feels like you've cut off a part of his humanity. Nobody's saying it's easy. You didn't kill you didn't do anything wrong, but now you've got new information. What kind of conversation do you want to have with your son about that and even about the past? And that's actually one of the cool things is in the multi-day trainings that I do, I have men and women go and have conversations about this stuff with people in their lives. And some of them for the first time, they come back and they're like, I've been married 20 years, 25 years. I never talked to my husband about being a man. So it's very, very powerful. Well, you begin to do that in your personal life, and then you begin to see how that also shows up professionally in your therapeutic life, or just it attracts you to getting back into therapy or getting into your own 12-step program or some other kind of group or something like that. So that's kind of where it leads, right? The real men don't feel is a very powerful rule. And of course, the real men don't feel, even though I get this rule every single time I do this talk, every time I put it out to the audience, that's the rule they give me. But that's not really the rule. It's real men don't feel other than anger or it's all good kind of expression, right? And so that's part of it too. But it goes back to this thing of safety. How old were you when you got the message that you were safer if you followed the man rules? That's a powerful question for men to explore. How old were you when you got the message that the man rules will keep you safe? All right. So I want to do something. Jen and Alyssa are going to help me out because I can't see the chat. But I want to just kind of get your reactions up until this point, kind of using this role play. Okay. So a client comes to you and says, I don't think that a male client, okay, comes to you and says, I don't think that gender stuff affects me. I'm just the person I am. I don't pay attention to any of that. Now, as a therapist hearing that, and especially in light of everything we've talked about up until this point, just throw in the chat, what would be some of your responses, do you think, to engage in this conversation? Not to prove them wrong, but to maybe kind of have an opportunity to look a little bit more at how maybe it does affect them.
We're slowly having stuff come into the chat. We have one person saying, how does that feeling impact the man you want to be? Another person saying, what kind of man do you want to be? Another person, well, we can talk about ways that might be affecting you. Well, can we talk about ways that might be affecting you? A lot of people are, what kind of person are you or do you want to be? A lot of those are coming through.
Great. So that's a common kind of response, right? Is that question that I've been saying throughout is how does that affect the man you want to be, or what kind of man do you want to be? And you can use motivational interviewing in a situation like this to just kind of play a little bit around and in different ways, right? I don't think that gender stuff affects me. I'm just the person I am. I don't pay attention to any of that. Okay, great. Well, what would somebody look like who was affected by it? What would that what would that look like? Right? And I assume, and then another approach could be like, okay, if I'm understanding correctly, you identify as male. So what does it mean to you, as somebody said, right? What does it mean to you to be a man? I mean, if you're just the person you are, but you identify as a man, what does that look like? Does that have specifics? Are there certain things that you do or don't do? And then you begin, because part of what I believe, okay, this is my belief. I don't know if it's right. I believe every single one of us has a script inside for following gender the way we think we're supposed to. We've internalized that script, we've written that script, but we've also kind of had other people over the years, especially our caregivers, but others as well, kind of write the script as well. And then we took it on and we made it ours. And we're constantly following it, and we don't realize that we're following it. And so part of therapy and part of this work is to help unearth the script, is to help begin to see the script. What is that script that you're following? Because it is different for different people, because we've had different experiences. And so this is also where there could be some very appropriate, minimal self-disclosure. I had, I used to think I really wasn't affected by the man rules. And I was surprised to realize that I spent a lot of my time trying not to be my father, or whatever, however you want to say it. But those are the types of things. But if somebody kind of tries to move you out of the gender space, you can stay in it with them, and try to get that experience and where they're at. But the bottom line for me is I don't believe there's any such thing as gender neutral. And even the folks who identify as non-binary, guess what? They're following a script. Part of their script is not having a script, but there's still a script that's part of it. There's still an identity around that. But a lot of those folks, non-binary and trans, they have the benefit of stepping outside of the rigidity of the oppression of the rules. And I think that's kind of that's the bottom line. So again, this dichotomy that I talked about, it started with me in my master's research, just asking the question, how have your ideas of being a man changed since getting into recovery? And then I wrote A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, and I asked the same question. And the most common response, which was fascinating to me, the most common response that I got from men was that they haven't changed. My ideas of being a man haven't changed. And then I would be like, you mean you used to go around hugging other men? You used to talk about your feelings? You used to do this, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, oh. See, because nobody had put their recovery in a gender framework, in a gender lens, in a masculine lens, however you want to say it. Nobody had ever, you go to treatment, they tell you to do all this stuff so you can live, so you can keep your job, so you can keep living in your home, whatever it is. There's consequences if you don't learn to do this stuff. But the truth is, it is completely confronting your ideas of masculinity. And the more we call that out in treatment, and the more we help men see this, and the more we help men navigate that, the better. Because men are going to leave your program, as I've said numerous times already, they're going to leave your program, they're going to leave your services, and they're going to be confronted with this dichotomy on a daily basis. And if they're aware of it, it's a hell of a lot easier to navigate than just confronting it, because they run into it. And so part of the socialization process that I like to talk about really is that the feminine, when you are thinking about the binary, right? And the binary is still the dominant paradigm for gender. when you think of feminine, when you think of masculine, it's really kind of this bifurcation. It's really this kind of creation of half human beings, which is really unfortunate. And so anybody's recovery, anybody's therapy, any individual person, I mean, about becoming whole is beginning to look at what has been relegated to women, what has been relegated to men, and then who do I want to be if all of those are possible, if all of those are options for me. And so I always say it's not about doing it perfectly, it's about doing it consciously. And Brene Brown says, some of you probably heard of Brene Brown. I'm kidding. I figure most of you have. The messages and expectations that bring us to our knees are so organized by gender. She used to be really focused on gender. She's moved away from that quite a bit, I believe. But that statement, that's everything. The messages and expectations that bring us to our knees are so organized by gender. What brings women to their knees and people socialized as women? What brings female identified individuals to their knees are the woman rules that they have internalized in the scripts that they follow. My wife and I have been married for 20 years, and we are still regularly having conversations about the dynamics of these rules and the scripts and the pain of following them. And for both of us, for both of us, it's very cool to have that conversation in our relationship, and it runs very deep. So to talk a little bit about trauma, right? Because what I said about trauma kind of being treated as though it's a panacea, there's some truth to that. And there's some truth to the fact that the breakthroughs of trauma and how we are working with trauma and dealing with trauma and healing through trauma are incredible. Like there are people who have been so stuck in AA trying to use the steps to liberate themselves, and they're doing trauma work, and it's like the analogy I give is it's like being stuck in a bathtub full of water, and you've been trying to use a cup to get the water out, and then you finally realize there was a plug. That's the kind of breakthroughs that people are having with trauma. So don't get me wrong, I think it's amazing. And I also think the 12 steps are amazing and can be incredibly helpful. It's this synergy that's even more amazing. So trauma equals wound, right? That's literally the definition. But when I said trauma is a gendered experience, I would guess that every male identified individual at some level has this deep message inside of him that says trauma equals weak. And that, to me, that's what we're up against. I don't have trauma, right? What's another word for a man with trauma? Asshole. It's the externalization of these symptoms. It's the externalization of the behaviors of trauma that lead a lot of men down the road of being an asshole. I'm a recovering asshole myself. I've got about 24 hours. No. It's true, and that's where the compassion and the non-judgment comes in. But it's also where it's kind of like, hey man, like, is that who you want to be? Do you want to have 10 years of recovery and still be an asshole and then excuse it, or just use amends as a way to keep having to do this cycle, this dance with people in your life where you're an asshole and you make amends, you're an asshole and you make amends? And so it's like, what if it's trauma that's driving that? And so what is the connection between men's violence and men's trauma? I do another talk on that. Super intense talk and very personal, right? And what we know is there is no way to end men's violence without dealing with men's trauma. Now, we don't work in a field, or we don't have other fields that truly deeply recognize that, But I can say that unequivocally. I can also say, as a feminist, that we will never end patriarchy without dealing with the complexity of male trauma. I fundamentally believe that as well. So that's a whole conversation. But how do we help men begin to look at violence and violence on a continuum? Because if you ask some men what their experiences with violence are, they don't necessarily have a lot of appreciation. But like in helping men recover, when we did remember what's called that interactive lecture, when we do that interactive lecture on violence and abuse, they name every single kind of physical abuse, every single kind of emotional abuse, every single kind of verbal abuse, every single kind of sexual abuse. And we get them up all on the board on flip chart papers. And then they're looking at it. And when any human being looks at that list, then we realize we've all engaged in violence. We've all been abusive. And so then it's kind of nice actually, because then it's like, oh, we're all a part of this. Like we're all a part of this. Some are more extreme than others, but we're all a part of this. But what does that look like? And then that comes back to this whole conversation of power and control. How do you talk to somebody about power and control around this? And so having aspects of your work with men really look at this. We can't avoid this. It's very real. The majority of your men that you interact with, that you are going to work with, they need to have a conversation about violence and trauma because of how it's affecting their lives. The easiest way for a man not to have trauma is to simply say it's not trauma. That's it. Oh, what happened to me? That wasn't trauma. No, that was fine. That wasn't bad. That made me the man that I am. It's not trauma. I mean, we can use so many other phrases that kind of take the place of that, but they basically mean it's not trauma. It's not trauma, right? We live in a society that basically looks at a lot of men's experiences and says it's not trauma. Men don't have trauma. And so we have to confront that. You know, we as professionals, we have to get rid of the lie that says women experience more trauma than men. I don't believe it, not for a second. I think it's about the same. In fact, I think boys are sexually abused at about the same rate as girls are. But we haven't talked about it, and then of course it's much more, you know, against the code for men to talk about sexual abuse, especially if they've been sexually abused by a man, and they identify as straight. So that's all part of it too, right? Like, what is the conversation? Then you begin to bring in the conversation of attachment. I love attachment conversations. I love attachment concepts. I love the whole thing has been just unbelievable for me to understand. I wish I had gotten this information when I first started my journey of recovery. My God, how much would have been different if I had understood all of the insecure attachment I had and what was happening in my relationships and happening to me. And the truth is, you know, what we know is that when baby boys are born, they are held less, caressed less, talked to in a different tone, allowed to be by themselves longer. All of those are aspects of attachment. So what I say is that in many ways, growing up a man in this society is its own attachment disorder. And we say we are all hardwired for relationship, right? All the pundits and the gurus all say, oh yes, it's all about connection and we're hardwired for relationship. Well, you know, the truth is, if you look at the man rules, they are all about disconnection. And when you are constantly being reinforced to disconnect, do you think you get wired for connection or disconnection? So we have these men who are coming into our programs who have been repeatedly hurt, who have then repeatedly disconnected and are living in these rules. I mean, don't cry, don't ask for help, don't be vulnerable, don't share feelings. That's all disconnection. That's the wiring of so many men. So we cannot act as though, oh, well, all human beings want to connect. So these guys just want to connect. Well, it's true. They want to connect. They have this desire to connect. But what happens when they do? What is the emotional uh, what is the emotional consequence for men when they attempt to connect? There's a whole nother kind of conversation that we can have about it. But the part of the way I talk about it is called the paradox of male relational intimacy. And what I realized was when I was thinking about relationships, and I wrote my second book, A Man's Way Through Relationships. I wrote that book and it took quite a bit to get published. But every man that I interviewed for A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, they all talked about relationships. And so I went and looked how many books have been written for men in relationships. And there have been almost none. I mean, like really focused on men in relationships. And then I went to these publishers and they're like, men aren't going to read a book about men in relationships. And I said, well, I can guarantee you one way they won't. And it hasn't been a New York Times bestseller. I'll be the first to admit that. But what I will say is that, yes, men deeply want to connect and they deeply want to have these relationships. But we have been trained, okay, and there's two different ways to think about this. You can say, oh, men just they're not very good at relationships. Okay, well, yeah, you could say that. I say men have been trained to be non-relational. Not that they have not developed relational skills, they have actually developed non-relational skills. And then we're surprised when they show up the way they do, or that they're confused about what they want in any kind of intimate or connecting relationship, whether it's a friendship, whether it's a intimacy partnership, whether, whatever it is. But this is why. You have the man rules again, and then you have what we ask people to do in healthy relationships. Now, again, and feel free, take pictures of these slides, but I think we need to talk to men about this. We need to help men see this. So when we go into our relationships, we're like, oh, that's what's happening. I've been taught my whole life not to show emotions, and now she's asking me or he's asking me to share feelings. Oh yeah, I'm not supposed to show weakness, but now I'm supposed to compromise. Never ask for help. It's a sign of weakness. You look like an idiot. I'm supposed to ask for help, or I'm supposed to fix everything. So when you take those things into context and that script that man has inside of him that he's following, that he doesn't even know he's following, and then he's really genuinely trying to show up in relationships. In fact, I would suggest to you that for those men who actually really attempt to share feelings and be intimate and compromise and risk trust, who really attempt to do these things, that's some of the most dangerous times. Why do I say that? Because if the man rules are about safety, then this is unsafe. And if this is unsafe, it is triggering. And if it's triggering, then that means that then we begin to see trauma responses. And when we see trauma responses, we also see those coping strategies come out. And when we see those coping strategies come out, that's when we also see the anger, and that's when we see the pushing away, and that's when we see the workaholism, and that's when we see the disconnection. We see all these different things that are trauma responses to attempts to be intimate. How's that? That to me, that's fascinating. And I don't hear a whole lot of people talking about that, but I think it would help a hell of a lot of men if we would just share this with them and talk to them about that and help them navigate it. Because when I talk to men about this, they're like, holy shit. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know exactly why I avoid conversations with my spouse, even though I really, really want to connect with her. Because the last time I did, and I was vulnerable with her. She wanted me to be vulnerable. And then the next thing you know, we're getting into a fight, or I am, creating a conflict with her. So, okay, maybe for some men, it doesn't apply as much. I don't know. But why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we exploring this with men, giving them this awareness so that they can navigate their relationships better? This plus awareness of attachment and attachment styles and how they respond with their attachment styles be a game changer for so many people. So this picture is really, so men, we jump into the waters of intimacy thinking it's the shallow end of the pool, only to realize that we've jumped into the deep end and can't quite keep our heads up. So it runs very deep. Real men don't feel except anger, right? So again, it goes back to that slide. So then we talk about this concept of the anger funnel. And again, if you work with men, you work with anger. And how do you work with the anger? How do you talk to them about it? Is the anger funnel original? It is not. Do a lot of people that I've worked with over the years find it very helpful compared to some of the other structures? They do. So if it's interest of you, this could be another tool. The men seem to really resonate with it too, because it's like, oh, like I've got these feelings and they're going into this funnel and they come out as anger. If I can stop them from going in the funnel and I can just at least have some sense of what I'm feeling, then that can make a difference. And we often think of anger, rage, and violence as kind of the continuum, but isolation, silence, and sarcasm, that internalized anger, that's part of it. And irrespective, it speaks to several other aspects, right, of men's emotional expression. One is that we have falsely gendered feelings. We have created this lie that says feelings have a gender. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. And in fact, do they have a gender when we're babies? When we're kids? I don't think so. It's not until gender conditioning comes in and says girls can't be angry, boys can't be sad, boys can't be insecure, boys can't be afraid, right? Girls can't be confident. It's not until that comes in that the emotional suppression starts. And so what this really is about is it's helping the men begin to see, oh, I have all these feelings. How do I want to express them? And does it mean anything about my masculinity? You can talk to men about their emotions and you can do the feelings wheel and you can do all this stuff with men, but if you're not connecting it to their masculine script, if you're not connecting it to their sense of male identity, I think you're missing on an opportunity to help them process it. Because a man can talk about his fear, but to give himself permission to feel afraid, he also has to work through the voice that says he's a pussy, the voice that says he's weak, the voice that says, all the derogatory stuff that he's internalized around these feelings. And so that's, that false gendering of feelings is part of it. But the other part is just like helping men realize, like, whether I am angry or not, I have an opportunity to just learn how to experience feelings. So again, men are not the problem. How men have been raised is the problem. And that all of this kind of led me to develop this idea, right? So you have traditional masculinity, which is just male socialization, right? Not right or wrong, not good or bad, but it's limiting. You cannot tell me that traditional masculinity is not limiting when you just look at the man rules. Then you have relaxed masculinity, which is recovery, which is a lot of therapy, right? The men, like, you cannot change your script of masculinity and be a part of recovery. Like you just can't. Like it's automatic, but it's not necessarily conscious. And that's what leads to conscious masculinity is it's like constantly asking, what kind of man do I want to be? What kind of man do I want to be? What kind of man do I want to be in this situation? What kind of father do I want to be? What kind of partner do I want to be? And it's conscious. And it's like noticing how often the script is coming up and the rules are coming up. And that's why it's enlightened choice that kind of drives the component. And you get stressed, you get triggered. What is likely to happen? At best, you revert to traditional masculinity. At worst, you revert to toxic masculinity. I don't really like the term toxic masculinity, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I do believe most toxic masculinity is driven by shame and trauma. So that leads us to like this idea, not just when I talk about the water, right? At the very beginning, I talked about the water. And the water is not like pristine. It's not really super clear. There are toxins in the water. And that's part of it for us. All of us. We're all in the water. And see, I hate the gender rhetoric that pits us against each other because we're all in the water. We've all grown up with gender conditioning. Some of us, as a result of gender conditioning, have been given great advantage, and some of us have been given great disadvantage. There's no question about that. But it's the same thing with racial identity and racial conditioning, and other aspects of like sexual orientation and other issues, right? I mean, that's all stuff that's in the water, but we're all in the water together, and it can be quite toxic. And so it's not men who are toxic, I would suggest. The majority of it is toxic behavior. And the majority of that behavior is coming out of a toxic culture of masculinity. When we call it toxic masculinity, then what we're really doing is we are denigrating men as though, and this is how some people talk about it, as though there is something just inherently wrong with men. And I really do not care for that kind of rhetoric. And I think it's just it's that sad kind of interplay when disadvantaged or marginalized groups kind of begin to speak up and find a voice, but the way that they do it sometimes is to just simply attack and to attack, defame, and insult, others. And that's been a part of identity politics forever, and it's just a challenge. And that's why I so appreciated the interaction I had with that individual at the conference, because it was just one of respect. And I think they knew that I'm an ally, and I think they knew that I was doing the best I could. And I think we could all give each other just a little more grace when it comes to this stuff, and just be a little more responsible for, our own emotional reactions. So what is healing trauma? What does it look like? Obviously, the paths are many, but it is deeply connected to conscious masculinity if you take a gender responsive approach. If you want to be gender responsive, if you want to work more effectively with men, then I would say healing trauma and conscious masculinity, they go together. The shift is from victim to survivor and perpetrator to protector. The trauma response is, again, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, but do they look different through a gendered lens? I think absolutely they do. And then when you begin to think about it from a gendered lens, that's when you begin to see, oh, that could be a trauma response, instead of that guy's just an asshole. Or that could be a trauma response instead of, oh, that's just Superman. There could be different aspects. And just in case you're not familiar with the fawn response, it's fight, flight, freeze, and now fawn is a big one. And what that basically is is particularly when growing up and you are in an abusive environment and you have the perpetrator, you have the abuser, and you learn that the best way to mollify them, the best way to kind of keep peace is to do everything you can to please them, everything you can to keep peace, everything you can to keep them happy. That's the fawning trauma response. And we see that, of course, show up in relationships all of the time. But then that also, it's not just, trauma is so layered and there's so many aspects to it. And so there's social traumas, right? There's the cause by experiences with prejudice and discrimination on a personal level, as well as cultural and structural inequities based upon race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, and disabilities. And so those are the traumas that, like, the more you are from a dominant group, the less you are able or likely to understand the social traumas, right? So it's our job to recognize our power, to recognize our privilege, to recognize our advantage, and then to learn more and more about these social traumas. There is an amazing show on Hulu. I believe it's on Hulu with Kerry Washington and Delmar Lindo. And I believe it was called Unprisoned. Pretty sure it was called Unprisoned, but it is amazing. And it is an amazing show that delves into the intersection of race, gender, and trauma in a really beautiful way. I really hope there's another season. But it's such an enlightened show, it probably won't get a second season. Then there's the question about us. What about us? You have vicarious trauma, compassion, fatigue, right? Here's the thing about vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. Vicarious trauma is probably inevitable to some degree. I mean, certainly you being triggered is almost inevitable in doing this work. And if you're going to do the kind of deeper work, and if you're going to do more kind of meaningful work around gender, that's going to be triggering for you, right? So you have vicarious trauma. The more work you do, the less vicarious trauma you have. The more your own personal work you do, the less you are impacted by the trauma of others. The more you're able to stand with somebody in their pain, in their suffering, and not have it get too much on you. That being said, you can be as healthy as you want. If you're doing really deep, constant trauma work, there's probably going to still be some vicarious trauma. And then the compassion fatigue, the compassion fatigue is very real, but again, the answer is self-care. The answer is dealing with your own stuff. So many of us we get into this work with the idea that we're going to help others, but we so often miss the idea of how much we got into this to help ourselves, that some part of us knew that we needed to heal. And if we pay attention to that and we commit to that and we keep doing that, it's unbelievable. And then you're much more effective. Compassion fatigue is not an issue if you're taking care of yourself and if you're truly immersed in balance in your life with the people with whom you're working. But if you're saving them and you're on a mission to save them, compassion fatigue will help you, bring you to your knees to realize you can't save a single person, but you can certainly help point the way to their freedom. Post-traumatic growth, I love the concept of post-traumatic growth. We have to talk about it more and more. And it's just this idea that these are the riches and the spoils that come out of trauma. I mean, probably the great saying for post-traumatic growth is the Buddhist saying, no mud, no lotus. The trauma is the mud and the lotus is the growth that we get. Who I am today is absolutely, unequivocally, could not be without having done all of the work that I've done to deal with the traumas that I had as a child and to put them in perspective, to truly be able to put them in perspective too. But the post-traumatic growth for your clients, I mean, it's amazing. And we want to give them that vision, you know, like in AA, they have a vision for you. They knew like we really got to build up like what this could look like. And that's post-traumatic growth for our clients. It's like create the vision of the work. You know, it's maybe hard work, but here's what's possible on the other side. And then that creates and often is driven by resilience. And resilience is an amazing concept because it also helps us to understand how people get through some of the toughest things in ways that others don't. That maybe because of their resilience, because of their internal and external positive coping skills, that they're able to navigate some things with, you know, just an amazing amount of grace. At the same time, I always try to emphasize the fact that we can't, especially for men, right? We can't confuse resilience with just grinning and getting through it, right? Gritting your teeth and getting through it. It's two different things, two different things. So we have to always keep that in mind. The wisdom of trauma, that's a line from Gabor Mate. I there's some things I really like about Gabor Mate. There's some other things I don't really agree with him on, but I love this: the wisdom of trauma. Trauma speaks to us, like it speaks to our life experience. For your clients, as they try to like when they ask the question, why did this happen to me, why did I have to go through this, we don't have an answer for that, except the wisdom of trauma can share that, can the wisdom of trauma can really unfold that for them in a very powerful way. All right, so we're going to do one more role play. We have 15 minutes left. Here's a common thing from male clients, right? None of that shit affected me, right? None of that, how I was treated growing up and the trauma, what you call it, trauma, I don't care. If anything, it made me stronger. I don't think about it. In light of everything we've talked about up to this point, and kind of this gendered experience of trauma and how you shift and help men begin to see things a little bit differently, what are some responses that you can think of to that comment? None of that shit affected me. If anything, it made me stronger. I don't think about it. And then Jen and Alyssa, if you would share with me what we're seeing.
Someone put in the chat, how could it not affect you?
Okay. That response, so that's, I really appreciate them sharing that response. That response is probably not something that I would respond to, like for a man who's already defended, right? And I think I get the intention behind that comment. I don't think it's meant to be like shaming. It's meant to be more like, you know, let's look. But I think the language matters, and it matters for men. And so for a man to hear that, he'd be like, kind of, I think, could easily feel defensive for something like that. Whereas if we were to say something along the lines of, none of that shit affected me. If anything, it made me stronger. I don't think about it. Okay. I can see how it made you stronger, right? So now using some motivational interview, I can see how it made you stronger. But sometimes when we're strong, we forget how to give ourselves permission to just not have to be so strong, to let our guard down. And I'm wondering for you, you know, if you didn't if you had the strength, but what about that experience for you? Maybe not now, not now, but when you first experienced it, maybe what was that like? Something to the effect of we want to honor wherever somebody's at, right? That it's the real motivational interviewing approach of like we want to honor where they're at and create some degree of ambivalence at the same time because it's like um this presentation, what this man is saying right here is what he has to say to himself to protect himself. So this is his protection, this is his safety. So how do we honor that while at the same time begin to move a little bit into creating some ambivalence or at least a little bit of a sense of like, yeah, I see how it made you stronger. And, you know, you could go multiple directions, even with just acknowledging the strength, and then also like what does it take to maintain that strength, but also just kind of like okay, but when you first experienced it, you know, as a child, you shouldn't have to worry about being strong. You should be able to worry about being safe and being heard, or something to that effect. And then you look for like a little opening because that's what men are constantly kind of coming into therapy with is they're looking at their safety, their protective kind of shell, which is oftentimes built with the man rules. All right, I'm gonna move through this a little more quickly, just simply because of time. But motivational interviewing in men, you know, a lot of times when we learn motivational interviewing, we don't learn the kind of gendered component of it. So you have the stages of change, right? Pre-contemplation, contemplation, determination and preparation, action and maintenance, and then relapse can happen at any of these places. But here's some core principles of motivational interviewing in men. In the language of men, right, getting help is weak and for pussies, like it's that derogatory language that we use. Real men can figure it out for themselves. It feels like defeat. That's something I would emphasize. For men, therapy at first feels like defeat. For when a man demonstrates ambivalence about changing a behavior or engaging in therapy, that's when you can use motivational interviewing. And there's 4 components: partnership, acceptance, evocation, and compassion, and then 4 processes. I had hoped to kind of cover the 4 components and the 4 processes. I'm going to move through them fairly quickly. But you have partnership, right? Dancing versus wrestling. And you don't want to wrestle with a guy in therapy, but you avoiding the writing reflex and the expert trap. So sometimes guys can be like cocky, arrogant, entitled, and it can trigger for us the need to be right, the need to kind of go up a notch. So we have to be very, very careful of that. And then you use reflective listening and you use language that's going to resonate with a lot of men. We're on the same team. Let's get our hands dirty together. Let's do this together. I'm with you. And so they don't kind of have this idea of like, I got to do it by myself. Acceptance is unconditional positive regard, going back to Carl Rogers, right? Non-judgment. Accurate empathy. So we begin to sense their inner world accurately and help them to do the same. The rolling with the resistance. The man is in the driver's seat. That's huge. Rolling with the resistance, right? Rather than trying to prove our point, we hear the man, we roll with his resistance, and we let go of our agenda. And then the affirmation. And affirmation, regardless of how they may respond, tends to be very, very important for men. in being able to find their success. The evocation, inherent internal wisdom, looking at both reasons to change and not to change, right? Just that ambivalence piece. Strengths-based are really important to men. And then compassion, have your heart in the right place so the trust you engender will be deserved. That's obviously to us. The four processes, many strategies, again, reflective listening. So engaging is one process. The affirmations, again, men may externally blow these off, but they are critical to help interrupt the constant negativity internal. And then tapping into the client's value system, the man rules or something else. And that's where we get into the what kind of man do you want to be? Focusing a spirit of curiosity and balancing your own ideas for change with those of the client. You know, let go of your agenda of where you think he's supposed to be. I've had a lot of guys argue with me about what kind of man they want to be, in the sense that they say, well, this is who I want to be. And when they described it, I was like, in my immediate thought was like, oh, I can't support that. And then I realized like, oh, no, but that's who they want to be. That's what I'm going to support. And what's interesting is through the process of working with them, guess what? They weren't attached to that at all. If I had fought them on it, if I had tried to make them wrong for wanting a certain vision, it would not have helped. And the evoking, again, that's the ambivalence, right? Moving out, normalizing ambivalence, moving out of it, and then strengthening the change talk, that change is possible. So really envisioning the idea of change, and then sustain talk, lessening the change is not possible. Then all the planning. A lot of guys resonate with planning. A lot of guys resonate with structure. A lot of guys resonate with having something they can check off, accomplishments. You'd be amazed. If every therapy appointment you had with a man, you basically gave him like 3 things to accomplish and to come back and have them done. And he has those written down and can check them off. There tends to be a lot of resonance with that. What kind of man do you want to be? What kind of father do you want to be? Using Likert scales, again, a lot of men tend to be very analytical, tend to be very rational. So we meet them where they're at, and Likert scales are great for that. So here's some of the last stuff. I think I've got 5 minutes. Is that right? Oh, no, I've got a little more. So here are the key areas of focus for men in treatment, according to Dan, right? This is not, Harvard has not quite endorsed these yet. The role of male socialization on recovery. Okay, so that's the man rules, and just naming the man rules with the men you work with, and then really kind of doing the man rules and that dichotomy of the principles of recovery. Emotional awareness. And remember what I said, it's not like just a feelings chart. Men have been so programmed not to know what their emotions are and what their feelings are, that it's really delving into the gendered aspect of emotions. The role of anger and rage. If the majority of men have been told that they can be angry and that that's an acceptable feeling, we cannot punish men for being angry in treatment. We cannot just shut it down. And even rage, so when I consult with programs, I'm like, do you guys have a safe room for men to really get angry in? Like where they can know, I'm just going to beat the crap out of a punching bag, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, because I can't do anything else. I need to get to that space. The majority of programs I have interacted with do not have any such thing. Relational competence and intimacy. If men have been raised to be non-relational, we have to learn these skills. Literally, we should be teaching men relationship skills. This is how you interact. This is what it looks like. This is what's probably going on with you when you act this way. What else might be happening here? Here's a role play. All that kind of stuff should be happening. Healthy sexuality, I think I've said enough about that. I really believe looking at the sexualization of females and homophobia, transphobia, and all of that stuff is really powerful for men. They will resist it. They don't like it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to acknowledge it. They don't want to, a lot of the times, or they'll say, like, oh, well, I don't do that. I've never hit a woman. You know, they go to the extreme. And so we show all the different ways that that shows up and why that's important, why it matters, you know, to look at that. Again, going back to what kind of man do you want to be? Understanding violence, abuse, we talked about that, but just really, really breaking it down, really understanding it, delving into it for these men. The male experience of trauma. We have to stop presenting trauma as if it's gender neutral. It is not. I do not believe it ever will be. It's not, and healing trauma is not gender neutral any either. Male privilege and entitlement. Some of us need to look at it more than others. I mean, certainly, you know, a lot of like these young white men, some of them are more privileged and entitled than ever. And they don't get it, man. Like they really don't see it. They don't see what's happening. And so we can have open, interactive conversations with them where they begin to look at that and they begin to have some empathy for others, and begin to see kind of how their internalized ideas of who they are and their specialness. And it's not just white, it's not just young white guys, but I mean it's part of the young white culture, you know, is still some of the privilege and entitlement. And then looking at family, looking at things from the family perspective. The key approaches to developing the therapeutic alliance is safety is first, last, and foremost, and safety versus trust. And sometimes, as a friend of mine says, the best thing you can do to engender trust is to help somebody, or the best thing you can do to create safety is to give somebody permission not to trust you. Power and control versus collaboration, and really navigating that. And then again, viewing external behavior through the lens of safety and the man rules, not just what they're doing, but having a better appreciation for why is this man acting this way when he was just doing so well, or this or that. Clinging to the man rules is about safety. It's not defiance or disengagement. How does that behavior fit with the man you want to be? Again, that question. I truly believe we are a traumatized field, working with traumatized clients, sending them to a traumatized community. So it's about our work. It's about our recognizing that. It's about our healing that. It's also not about doing it perfectly. It's about doing it consciously. And really quick, I'll just give you my really quick commercial. That's Helping Men Recover. That's been out since 2011. We just revised it and put it out in November of 2022. These are my two books, A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps and A Man's Way Through Relationships. Amazing Dads is the first trauma-informed curriculum. It comes out next month. I'm super excited about that. Men's Healing, Healing Men's Pain is a men's trauma curriculum. It's 18 sessions. That comes out in May or June. We're just finalizing that. And then for the first time in the history of my company and the work that I've done, we're actually going to be doing stuff for women. I found an amazing woman, Dr. Sophia Murphy, and our publisher loved the idea of publishing women's versions of the two curricula coming out. And so there is Amazing Moms coming out. As far as we know, it's one of the first trauma-informed curriculas for moms. And then Healing Women's Pain, both of those coming out in like December of 2024. Another book that I have coming out, What Men Would Tell You If They Weren't Too Busy Watching TV. It's a book to women from men, by my good friend Alan Berger and myself. This is free. This is tip 56, addressing the specific behavioral health needs of men, tip 56 from SAMHSA. And this is another kind of mantra of my company. We cannot just change what men think. We have to change what we think about men. Thank you all. There again is the code. And I think I'm finished with 1 minute to go. So, yeah, Alyssa and Jen, do you have anything?
First off, I want to say thank you so much, Dan, for this great webinar. A lot of wonderful feedback and thanks in the chat. So thank you for all of this information. Just so everyone knows, I did put these reminders in the chat for you. We will be having the recording available on our Great Lakes ATTC website for 3 months. After 3 months, we are going to take that down. But we are not sharing out the PowerPoint slides. So if you want to refer back, check out our website, and the recording should be up tomorrow. Please make sure you take 2 to 3 minutes to fill out that post-event survey. The link is in the chat. You will also be redirected. Certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all who attended today's session in full, and it may take up to 2 weeks. I do know that we did not get all of the questions answered that came through the Q&A, so I will email those to Dan in hopes that he can answer those, and then I will email out those responses. So we really appreciate you all being here with us today. Thank you so much, Dan. Again, this was fabulous. So thank you all. And that is,
Thank you.
that is all we
Thank
have
you.
for the rest of the trading.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you all. Have a great day.